Most cinephiles would know that sound cinema began with the release of The Jazz Singer in 1927. But despite the incredible innovation that film made, and the flood of dozens of new sound films immediately following, sound wasn't actually utilized much in the first few years of its existence, and it wasn't utilized very effectively. It was used mainly to deliver exposition, and because the microphones were extremely heavy, it made it very difficult to record sound and image simultaneously. And if the filmmakers did decide to record them simultaneously, that cinematography became limited due to not being able to move the camera as much since they had to keep up with the microphones. So film started to become a series of shot-reverse shot dialogue scenes, with sound being used for nothing more and cinematography would largely be static. This is what many film scholars would label as the transitionary period for sound. 1932 was the breakthrough year with classics such as Trouble in Paradise and Scarface. But there was one film prior to this industry-wide breakthrough that was the first to crack the barrier that sound had first introduced. In 1931, German filmmaker Fritz Lang, who had already been known for his silent classics such as Metropolis and Destiny, released his magnum opus titled M. In M, Lang used sound to create a specific mood for certain scenes, connect multiple scenes together in a fluid motion, and create important plot points that would be integral to the outcome of events. Lang chose to shoot 2/3 of M silently, and would later record the audio separately and sync it up with what he'd already shot. Danish filmmaker Carl Theodor Dreyer would do something similar in his film Vampire just a year later. This allowed Lang to move his camera freely without being bogged down by the heavy microphones at the time. There are several methods Lang used and even created for the first time. In one scene, Lang intercuts between a group of criminals and a group of city officials, both discussing their own plans to catch the child murderer who is on the loose. The lines of dialogue smoothly help the constant transitions between the two settings and helps to link the two scenarios together. He does something similar in another scene when he chooses to have a narrator, who is a character within the film, speaking about how they will catch the killer, while Lang shows us various scenarios of the police scouring the streets for clues, which perfectly matches with what the narrator is describing. Lang also used off-camera sound, such as in the scene when the little girl jumps out of the way when a car comes driving by. We hear the honking of the car before we see it. Lang even created what we now know as sound bridges. He'd take a sound effect or line of dialogue from one scene and overlap it with another. For instance, when one of the men looking for the murderer gets caught by the police, he says a line, and while Lang holds on the current scene, the audio from the following scene already appears before Lang has even cut. This is another example of Lang using sound to link scenes, since you could actually be mistaken by thinking that the line the man says in the next scene is a part of the prior one, since he is trying to convince the police of his innocence in both scenarios. It's a bit like that scene in Dr. Zhivago.
Merry Christmas, Miss Lara!
Oh, thank you, and Merry Christmas to you.
Which reinforces just how influential many of Lang's techniques were to future filmmakers. Another effect Lang would use to smoothly transition between scenes is merge two different sound effects, such as the chirping of a cuckoo clock and the honking of a car. Coincidentally, or maybe not, David Lean liked to utilize this technique as well. Lang was clearly very influential for Lean. Right after the little girl from the opening scene goes missing, we hear her mother calling out for her as Lang cuts to the empty stairwell of their apartment. If done in a silent film, the audience would just assume this cut meant a new scene or even an entirely different location, but being able to overlap the shouting from the mother not only shows this is the same scene, but reinforces the idea that something bad has happened to her, especially when Lang cuts to a shot of the ball she was playing with, now deserted all by itself, and then to a shot of the balloon the murderer had bought her, now also deserted. Despite Lang's accomplishments with sound in this film, he actually chooses to go silent with these couple shots, even more silent than most actual silent films would, since there's also no musical accompaniment like most silent films would have utilized. The juxtaposition of sound throughout the first 5 minutes or so of the film, only to cut to increasingly more eerie shots that imply the little girl's abduction while drowning out her mother's shouting, creates a psychological impact on the audience that wouldn't have been possible had the entire film been silent, which demonstrates that with sound also comes the responsibility to know when not to use it. And perhaps the most vital part of the film uses sound for the murderer's whistling. The first time we see him kidnap a victim, we hear him whistling a tune. Much later on in the film, the blind old man selling balloons from the beginning of the film recognizes the tune, realizing that he first heard it the same day the little girl from the beginning was abducted.
Nano, das habe ich doch schon mal gehört.
Leads to the murderer's presence being known to the mob that's looking for him, and a chase ensuing, which then leads to his capture. Sound still very much exists in silent films, it's just that we can't hear it, but the characters can. We could have easily had the old blind man hear this tune in a silent version of this film, but we as the audience would not have been able to put two and two together, since we have no idea what the whistling sounds like. But with the use of sound, we are able to pick up on exactly what the old man picks up on. I don't think it's any coincidence the writers made the man who recognizes the song blind. It reinforces the idea that in some situations, sound is more vital than sight. This plot point eventually leads to the murderer's arrest, a crucial part of the film that could not have been done had this been a silent film. Lang clearly knew that sound could be used for far more than just shot-reverse shot dialogue scenes and musical numbers. Sound could create another layer to cinema, and rather than using it as a crutch like so many films nowadays, Lang used it to expand upon the medium of film, in a way few filmmakers have since.